Look at the monitors. His pressure is dropping. Do something right now or you're gonna lose him.
The heart monitor flatlined for half a second. Then chaos. That's it. Call it. The surgeon's voice cut through the operating room like a blade. Time of death, wait. The word came from the far side of the table. Everyone froze. The trauma bay inside Walter Reed National Military Medical Center was loud, ventilators hissing, metal trays rattling, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the body on the table. Captain Harris didn't look up. Who said that? A gloved hand rose slightly. The youngest person in the room. I did, sir. Harris turned slowly. His mask couldn't hide the irritation tightening his eyes. You're the new rotation nurse, correct? Yes, sir. Then observe. Don't interrupt. The monitor gave a weak blip. Then nothing again. Across the table lay Commander Blake Mercer, a decorated officer from the United States Navy. Shrapnel trauma. Massive internal bleeding. 2 hours on the table already. The kind of case that drains even seasoned surgeons. We've clamped everything we can, Harris snapped. We've transfused 8 units. His body's done. The nurse didn't move away. With respect, sir, she said quietly, his pupils are reactive. Harris's head lifted. The anesthesiologist glanced at the light. A pause. There, slightly reactive. That's residual, Harris fired back. Spinal reflex. The nurse stepped closer to the table. His left hand moved. It's a nerve discharge. No, sir, she said, firmer now. It was intentional. A metal instrument clattered as Harris dropped it onto the tray. You are out of line. The room tightened. 2 corpsmen near the wall exchanged glances but stayed silent. Harris leaned across the table toward her. Do you understand who you're speaking to? Yes, sir. Then act like it. Another flat tone from the monitor. The anesthesiologist adjusted the ventilator settings. Pressure's crashing. Harris turned back to the body. Prepare to terminate resuscitation. The nurse's jaw tightened under her mask. Sir, she said again. This time louder. The entire room looked at her. If we reposition him 20 degrees right and relieve pressure under the diaphragm, you may get perfusion back to the heart. Harris blinked once, then laughed. A short, humorless sound. You think after 22 years in trauma surgery, I forgot how to position a patient? No, sir. Then what exactly are you suggesting? That the shrapnel isn't the only issue. Silence. Harris straightened. Explain. His collapse wasn't linear. It was delayed. That suggests compression, not blood loss. We scanned him. Yes, sir. Supine. Harris stared at her. You're telling me, he said slowly, that every trauma specialist in this room missed something because we didn't tilt the table. The nurse didn't blink. I'm saying he's not gone yet. The heart monitor gave another weak flicker. Then faded. Harris exhaled sharply. Enough. We are not experimenting on a dying officer because a rookie nurse reads something in a manual. Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't a manual, sir. He ignored that. Time of death, sir. The anesthesiologist's voice cracked. There's electrical activity. Faint, but it's there. All eyes snapped to the screen. A thin, trembling line. Not flat. Harris's jaw flexed. It's noise. The nurse moved before anyone could stop her. She reached for the table controls. Don't you touch, the table shifted. 20 degrees to the right. A collective breath held. 3 seconds. 4. The monitors sputtered. A pulse. Weak. Irregular. But present. The room erupted. Pressure rising. Get dopamine ready. Charging defib just in case. Harris stared at the screen as the rhythm stabilized into something fragile, but unmistakably alive. His voice dropped. How? The nurse didn't answer immediately. She adjusted a line, checked the airway, movements precise and controlled. Another pulse echoed through the speakers. Stronger. Harris looked at her differently now. Not angry. Calculating. You had no authority to override me. No, sir. But you did it anyway. Yes, sir. Why? She met his eyes across the operating table. Because he wasn't finished fighting. The words landed hard. For a moment, no one spoke. The monitor continued its uneven rhythm, stubborn and alive. Harris stepped back from the table. The room moved around him. Medications, commands, renewed urgency, but something in his posture had shifted. He looked at the nurse again. "You'd better be right," he said quietly. Her response was simple. "I am, sir." And as the pulse grew stronger under the steady hum of machines, the power in the room, subtle, invisible, undeniable, began to move. The trauma bay never got quiet, not truly. Even after the pulse stabilized, the ventilators hissed like restless ghosts, and the fluorescent lights above flickered as if unsure they wanted to remain on. The scent of antiseptic clung to the air, sharp enough to burn the back of the throat. Every corner of the room was polished steel and hard angles. There was no softness anywhere, no excuses for weakness. Captain Harris stood with his arms crossed, shoulders rigid, staring at the monitor as though sheer will could explain what had just happened. Years in the Navy had carved him into a man who expected obedience, not argument. The kind of man who believed authority was earned through rank, not discussion. His green fatigues were pressed to military perfection, the insignia on his chest catching the harsh light. Every movement he made radiated control, except now, that control felt tenuous. The nurse lieutenant, junior grade, Emma Lang, stood a few feet from the table, gloved hands clasped, breathing steady. She was young, barely 2 years into her commission, her uniform spotless, but her eyes held a calm certainty that seemed out of place among the chaos. There was nothing flashy about her presence, no medals, no loud voice, no attempt to dominate, but in this room, that quiet confidence cut through more sharply than Harris's authority ever could. "Chief, prep the ore for follow-up," Harris sparked to a burly corpsman wiping sweat from his brow. "We'll stabilize him here, then move him." "Aye, sir," the corpsman replied, glancing once at Lang, as if expecting her to falter. She didn't. Lang adjusted a line on Mercer's arm, checking vitals, fingers light but precise. Blood pressure still trending low, she murmured, almost to herself. But Harris heard it. "You're monitoring him like I can't," he asked, voice low but sharp. "I'm supporting you, sir," she said, keeping her tone even. "He's responding to fluids and repositioning. That's all." Harris's jaw flexed. He wanted to dismiss her, wanted to assert dominance the way his rank demanded. But something about the way she moved, deliberate and measured, made him hesitate. Across the room, the anesthesiologist, Lieutenant Commander Patel, adjusted the ventilator settings, eyes darting between the monitors and the patient. "You've got to admit," he said under his breath to Harris, "she knows what she's doing." Harris didn't answer. He focused on Mercer's chest rising and falling under the sheets, the faint line of sweat tracing down the officer's temple. Mercer, unconscious and vulnerable, was a high-value target, not just because of his rank, but because he represented the Navy's elite. Every officer in the building knew it. If he didn't survive, the consequences would ripple far beyond this room. Lang's voice cut through, calm but firm. "Sir, we need to check the abdominal pressure again. It's still elevated. Could compromise cardiac output." Harris's eyes narrowed. He had been trained to think fast, act faster. Everything in his career had conditioned him to solve problems immediately, decisively, often alone. And yet here, with a young nurse pointing out details he'd overlooked, he found himself listening. "You're suggesting what exactly?" he asked. "That the intra-abdominal pressure is masking perfusion. If we relieve it incrementally, we can sustain the cardiac output long enough to get him to the ore." Harris rubbed his forehead beneath the mask. "Incrementally? You mean we watch him like he's an experiment?" Lang didn't flinch. "We're observing responses, yes. But it's controlled, sir. He's still alive. That's the priority." The room itself seemed to tighten around them, walls of steel and tile reflecting the fluorescent glare, the faint hum of the ventilation system underscoring every heartbeat. This was a military hospital, after all, not a civilian trauma center. Every decision carried not just life or death, but reputations, ranks, and the unspoken rules of authority. A wrong move could echo through the chain of command. Corpsmen moved with quiet efficiency, sliding trays of instruments, adjusting four lines, ready to obey the orders they'd been given. No one spoke unnecessarily. The only sounds were the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the hiss of gas masks, and the occasional instruction clipped short. Lang leaned closer to Mercer's arm. Her fingers traced the pulse, checking strength and regularity. He's stabilizing. Not fully, but improving. We can maintain this. Harris stepped back, hands on hips, assessing the room. He had always defined leadership by control, by ensuring everyone fell in line. And yet here, in the very place where rank should have dictated outcomes, he was forced to acknowledge her competence. She wasn't challenging him in words. She didn't have to, but her actions demanded recognition. A lieutenant junior grade might not have the authority to override a captain. But in this environment, authority wasn't just rank, it was knowledge, precision, and timing. And in this room, Lang had all three. Harris exhaled slowly, shoulders rigid but less so. Keep monitoring. I want updates every 5 minutes, he said, finally. Yes, sir, Lang replied. And as she checked another line, another reading, another subtle indicator of Mercer's condition, it became clear. Hierarchy here was not just about insignia or years served. In a place where lives were measured in seconds, competency could shift power faster than any promotion. Outside the trauma bay, the corridor buzzed with military efficiency. Orders, reports, and footsteps created a steady pulse that reminded everyone of the chain of command beyond this room. Inside, though, in the harsh light of monitors and life-saving equipment, the old rules were being tested. Harris glanced at Lang again. She didn't smile, didn't seek approval. She simply did her job with a calm precision that challenged his assumptions, undermined the expected hierarchy, and yet, paradoxically, commanded respect. Even in a world built on rank and discipline, the truth remained. Sometimes, authority was less about position and more about action. And Mercer, fragile, unconscious, yet still fighting, was the reason they all had to reconcile with that truth. By mid-morning, word of the incident had spread. The trauma bay wasn't private anymore. The whispers had followed the corridors, clinging to every officer who passed through. Harris didn't need to speak. The looks on the faces of the residents, corpsmen, and other attending physicians said it all. A rookie nurse had defied him, and the ripple was immediate. He strode into the surgical observation room, the fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows across his brow. Every step echoed off the sterile walls. The entire staff turned toward him instinctively, some out of respect, others out of fear. Lieutenant Lang. His voice, usually measured, now carried the weight of authority sharpened by frustration. Report to me. Now. Lang approached, hands clasped behind her back, eyes forward. She walked past murmuring interns and residents who parted silently, the room thick with tension. No one spoke. The air was taut, as if holding its breath. Sir, she said once she reached him. You thought it wise to override my orders yesterday, Harris said, pacing slowly. Explain yourself. Lang's jaw flexed beneath the mask. Sir, I acted on immediate observations to preserve life. That was my only goal. Harris stopped, letting silence settle. Then he leaned in closer, voice low but dangerous. Your goal doesn't give you the right to undermine the chain of command. Do you understand that? Yes, sir. Good. Then you will respect my authority. Or there will be consequences. The words hung in the air like the stench of antiseptic. Corpsmen shifted uneasily, and interns exchanged glances. Authority was sacred here. To see it challenged, even quietly, was uncomfortable, unsettling. Later, in the hospital's central briefing room, Harris staged the next step of his escalation. Mercer had been moved to the intensive care unit, stabilized but still vulnerable. Harris had requested a review of the incident, public enough to draw senior officers and administrators. Lang entered the room behind him, as ordered, clipboard in hand. She stayed silent, letting Harris present the case. He outlined the morning's events with careful precision, emphasizing her insubordination and the risk she had imposed. His tone was formal, professional, but the undercurrent of blame was undeniable. This, Harris said, pointing to her name on the report, is an example of what happens when rank is ignored. Protocol exists for a reason. Even well-meaning actions can jeopardize a patient's life. You will take this seriously. Lang's posture didn't shift. She nodded once, crisp. No explanation. No appeal. Just acknowledgement. The senior officers, 2 colonels, a lieutenant commander, and a civilian hospital administrator, listened with varying expressions. Some frowned, some scribbled notes. The tension was thick, nearly physical. Harris continued. As of this morning, Lieutenant Lang will report directly to me for all procedures involving trauma patients. Any deviation will result in formal disciplinary action. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Lang's colleagues shot her small, sympathetic glances, but she didn't respond. She simply adjusted her clipboard, silent as a shadow. After the briefing, Harris didn't let up. He sent Lang to attend to the mundane, demeaning tasks often reserved for rookies: inventory checks, supply runs, cleaning equipment. Each assignment came with an audience: interns, corpsmen, even the senior administrators who had been present at the briefing. Every task was a quiet reminder of her place. Lang moved through each assignment with efficiency, her hands steady, movements deliberate. But the eyes watching her weren't forgiving. Every time she checked for supplies or scrubbed a tray, whispers followed. You'd think she'd have learned her lesson, one resident muttered. Another shook his head, lips pressed tight. Harris, meanwhile, leaned against a doorway, arms crossed. He watched her work, noting the subtle defiance in her posture. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't panicked. And that, more than anything, irritated him. Authority demanded compliance. Obedience was its currency. Her calm made him question how much he could control. By afternoon, Harris escalated further. He arranged for a multi-department review, a panel of senior surgeons to assess the events in the trauma bay. Lang was required to present her reasoning, defend her actions in front of an audience of peers and superiors. The room was packed. The hum of fluorescent lights mingled with the low chatter of medical staff. Lang stood at the front, her clipboard held against her chest, every eye in the room on her. Harris sat at the head of the table, leaning back, arms folded. His expression was calm but predatory. "You may begin," he said, voice carrying across the room. Lang spoke deliberately. She described the patient's vitals, the observed reflexes, the steps she had taken to stabilize him. She didn't apologize. She didn't embellish. Every word was factual, precise, grounded in what she had seen and done. Harris interjected several times. "But you ignored direct orders." "Yes, sir," she replied evenly, because those orders would have led to further deterioration. "I acted in real time to preserve life." The panel murmured. A colonel raised an eyebrow. The administrator scribbled in her notebook. Harris's jaw tightened. "You understand the implications," he said, voice low, almost dangerous. "A single misstep like this could have cost lives. You need to acknowledge that." "I do," Lang said. Her voice never wavered. "I also acknowledge that without immediate action, Commander Mercer may not have survived long enough for further intervention." Harris leaned back. The room was silent now. The audience of officers and medical staff exchanged subtle glances, some intrigued, some disapproving of the way she quietly refused to collapse under pressure. After the panel, Harris walked with Lang down the hospital corridor. Each step echoed off the sterile walls, a reminder of hierarchy, chain of command, and the public scrutiny she now carried. "You will follow orders exactly from now on," he said, voice measured but sharp. "Your judgment is secondary to mine." "Yes, sir," Lang replied, tone neutral. Harris studied her for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. "Make no mistake. I could have you reassigned. You could face formal reprimand. Consider yourself lucky I chose instruction instead of punishment." Lang didn't flinch. Her hands remained at her sides, fingers unclenched, eyes forward. Nothing in her posture betrayed fear. Harris exhaled slowly, almost unconsciously. The nurse had survived the first wave of his authority, but he could escalate further. He had options. And in the military, the hierarchy was his weapon. Meanwhile, the whispers never stopped. In the mess hall, in hallways, in supply rooms, everyone knew what had happened. The rookie nurse who defied a captain. The pulse of the rumor mill rose with every passing hour. Lang's quiet competence had become a spectacle of subtle humiliation, orchestrated with precision by Harris. But Lang didn't seem to notice. She completed each task, moved through every public observation, and continued to check vitals, monitor lines, and maintain her calm focus. Harris realized, with a tightening in his chest he refused to admit, that control was slipping, not completely, not yet, but enough that every additional escalation would require more force, more humiliation, more exposure. And in this environment, force had a cost. Every misuse of authority left a mark, visible only to those paying close attention. Lang moved through the day, measured, deliberate, unstoppable in her quiet defiance. By the time the lights in the trauma bay dimmed for evening checks, the tension hadn't eased. Harris could feel it in the stiff posture of the staff, in the murmurs that followed her down the hall, in the weight of the hierarchy bending, ever so slightly, under her calm certainty. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By late evening, the hospital had quieted. The fluorescent lights above the trauma bay hummed steadily, a low, unchanging drone that seemed to underscore the residual tension in the air. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes along the main corridor, but inside, the sterile walls reflected only the muted glow of monitors and the occasional flicker of overhead bulbs. Lieutenant Lang moved silently among the equipment, checking lines and vitals on her clipboard. Her hands were steady, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. The corpsmen around her worked efficiently, but their eyes occasionally flicked toward her, subtle, questioning, as if unsure what to make of the calm precision she carried. Some glanced at Harris, waiting for his signal, but he remained at the far end of the room, posture rigid, expression unreadable. It wasn't the first time someone had noticed her. "Do you think she really knows what she's doing?" one resident whispered to another while adjusting an 4. They kept their voices low, careful not to attract attention. The question wasn't meant to be answered, it was meant to be observed. A test of perception. Lang didn't look up. She didn't need to. The room itself seemed to acknowledge her presence. Monitors beeped in rhythm with Mercer's steady pulse, ventilators hissed in quiet accompaniment, and yet, in the subtle pauses between sounds, there was a sense of something restrained, barely contained. Harris stood with his arms crossed, leaning against the wall near the observation window. He was quiet, unusually so. He watched her with eyes that flickered between calculation and irritation. Every so often, he adjusted his stance, shifted weight from one foot to the other, but never spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it carried judgment, authority, and something unspoken, a question he hadn't yet formulated. Even the anesthesiologist, Lieutenant Commander Patel, who had been skeptical earlier, found himself unconsciously drawn to her side during vital checks. Patel didn't comment, didn't offer advice, but his repeated glances betrayed a creeping unease, a sense that perhaps this nurse's actions weren't entirely ordinary. Lang moved along the edge of the bed, inspecting the readings, repositioning a line with subtle precision. Her fingers lingered briefly on the pulse monitor, adjusting the sensor just enough to optimize reading accuracy. Harris noted it. So did Patel. Corpsmen watching from the corner noted it. But no one said anything. "Sir," Lang said quietly, almost to herself, as she checked the oxygen saturation, "his left arm is responding differently than expected. Could indicate compromised perfusion distal to the central line." Harris froze mid-step, hand hovering near a tray of surgical instruments. "Could indicate, what exactly?" His voice was controlled, measured, but the tension in the room ratcheted up. "Possibly underreported internal pressure," Lang replied, voice calm, unflinching. "Could be masking cardiac output variations." Harris's jaw flexed beneath the mask. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Her calm assessment, delivered without hesitation, carried a weight that made him uneasy, as if the room itself had shifted slightly on its axis. The corpsman whispered again, just below hearing range. "Did she just notice that?" Patel's eyes narrowed. The subtlety of her observation wasn't obvious at first glance. Only someone trained to notice small deviations in vital signs could detect it, yet she did it instinctively. And she wasn't speaking to anyone, wasn't showing off. She was simply observing. Mercer remained unconscious, sheets drawn high over his chest, still breathing through the ventilator. But his stillness belied the undercurrent of scrutiny swirling in the room. Harris noticed the quiet too, how everyone's movements seemed to circle Lang like a subtle gravity, and how small, almost imperceptible cues, the tilt of her head, the shift of a hand, the timing of a glance, pulled attention without command. Even during a routine rounds check, subtle unease hung over the group. Harris walked with the nurse at the side of the bed while Patel and the corpsman adjusted lines and medications. Every instruction Harris issued seemed slightly muted by the undercurrent of confidence emanating from Lang. Not arrogance, not overt challenge, just an unwavering certainty that kept everyone slightly off balance. Lang didn't speak unless necessary, but when she did, her words carried precision. Pressure stable. No further complications detected. Peripheral perfusion within expected limits. Each phrase was short, clipped, efficient, and yet it created a pause, a micro-hesitation, in the minds of those who heard it. Harris found himself noticing other things now. The way Lang moved through the room, deliberate, controlled, never rushed, yet always faster in execution than any command he could issue. The way she seemed aware of minor fluctuations in equipment or patient response before anyone else. Small things, a blinking light on a monitor, the faint change in a ventilator hiss, the nearly imperceptible shift in a patient's hand. Each tiny observation registered with her instinctively, almost like she had read the room in ways he hadn't anticipated. Patel cleared his throat, subtly glancing at Harris. "She's thorough," he muttered, almost under his breath. Harris's eyes flicked toward him but said nothing, unwilling to give verbal acknowledgement, yet unwilling to ignore the unease settling in his chest. Even the corpsman, hardened by years of routine, noticed the subtle difference. One of them, young and usually unflappable, glanced at her hand movements during a line adjustment and whispered quietly, "How does she know that?" His partner shook his head, shrugging. No answer, just observation. Lang paused mid-check, fingers resting lightly on a monitor, then glanced toward the door where Harris was standing. For a fraction of a second, her gaze met his. There was no challenge, no aggression. Only quiet assurance, precise and unshakable. The room seemed to hold its breath with her. Harris noticed it, the momentary stillness, the subtle but undeniable shift in control, though he refused to name it. Even Mercer's body seemed to respond. The faint twitch in his left hand, almost imperceptible, drew attention again. Corpsmen and residents noticed it, but Lang was the first to act, adjusting lines and monitoring without a word. The movement wasn't dramatic, but it set everyone on edge. Something about the subtle precision of her actions suggested she was seeing things no one else could or would. As night deepened, the tension remained. Harris watched her from the far side of the room, standing rigid, jaw clenched, hands folded behind his back. He didn't understand how a junior-grade nurse had managed to unsettle the entire hierarchy so quietly. Yet every action she took reinforced it. The room obeyed her not by command, but by the meticulous inevitability of her focus. Lang's voice broke the quiet again, soft and deliberate. "Vitals stable for the next cycle. No signs of decline." Harris exhaled slowly, shoulders rigid. No one moved for a moment, not out of fear, but because the subtle balance in the room had shifted just enough to make everyone pause. The quiet had weight now, heavy and controlled. He didn't know what it meant, not yet. But he could feel it, the creeping realization that something about her wasn't what it seemed. Something beneath the surface, precise, deliberate, and entirely concealed. And in a place governed by strict hierarchy and unflinching obedience, that unease carried more danger than any shrapnel or failing organ ever could. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, its second hand loud in the quiet of the ICU. Mercer's ventilator hissed in steady rhythm, but the monitors were alive with subtle fluctuations, tiny spikes, imperceptible dips. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and fatigue, but also something else, something harder to name. Tension stretched so thin it was almost audible. Lieutenant Lang moved along the bed with deliberate calm, adjusting lines and monitoring the patient's readings. Her gloves made soft, measured sounds against the metal equipment, each movement precise, each touch calculated. Harris leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, watching her. The irritation in his chest had grown into something heavier, a nagging doubt that he refused to admit aloud. His pressures holding, Lang murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Then she paused, eyes narrowing. Slight arrhythmia. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to notice if you're looking. Harris's head jerked. Not enough to trigger alarms. Yes, sir. But it's there. Her voice was calm, professional. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Harris exhaled, unconsciously rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had been monitoring Mercer all evening, yet she noticed something he hadn't. Something subtle. A small, almost imperceptible sign that the experienced trauma team had missed. The anesthesiologist, Patel, glanced at her again, eyebrows raised. He made no comment. His silence spoke volumes. He wasn't sure whether to be impressed or unnerved. Then, a near miss, a drop in oxygen saturation. The alarm didn't sound, just a soft beep that only a trained eye would notice. Lang reacted immediately, adjusting the ventilator settings and repositioning the line. The drop was brief, a fraction of a second, but enough to have put Mercer at risk if unattended. Harris's chest tightened. He had been monitoring the patient's vitals all evening. He had been watching. And yet, in that brief moment, she had acted faster, more accurately, more intuitively than he or anyone else had. He stepped forward, masking his unease. How did you? He started, then cut himself off. He had no words that wouldn't undermine the authority he had spent decades building. Lang didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply continued her work, checking lines, noting the slight tremor in Mercer's left hand, adjusting the monitors just enough. Her efficiency was almost robotic, but the subtle confidence in her movements made the observers pause. A corpsman whispered to another, "Did she just anticipate that?" "Anticipate what?" The other replied, eyes wide. "That drop in oxygen. No one else saw it coming." Neither spoke above a whisper, but the murmurs reached Harris's ears despite himself. He exhaled slowly, jaw tight. He told himself it was nothing. She was just careful. She was thorough. But the way she moved, the way she reacted before any real change became visible, planted a seed of unease. Then another near miss. Mercer's blood pressure dipped again, subtly, almost within normal variance, but Lang noticed it immediately and adjusted the flow. She didn't speak, didn't make a show of it. She simply observed the subtle correction on the monitor and acted. Within seconds, the blood pressure normalized. Harris's hand hovered near a clipboard, but he didn't intervene. He didn't want to. Not because he couldn't, but because he was unsettled by her calm precision. The night passed with minor fluctuations, each one corrected before it became significant. Each correction was small, almost imperceptible, yet Harris began to notice the pattern. Lang was seeing things, noticing things, acting on things that no one else registered until after the fact. The subtlety was unnerving. Patel finally spoke, quietly, almost to himself. "I've never seen anyone catch all of this, before it escalates." Harris's eyes narrowed. "You're saying she's..." Patel cut himself off, shaking his head. "I don't know. But it's unusual. Very unusual." Lang glanced at the two men but said nothing. Her focus never wavered from the monitors, the lines, the patient. Nothing about her gave away what she was, or what she might be capable of. Yet, the room seemed to bend slightly around her, the subtle gravity of her competence pressing on everyone else. A near miss in conversation, too, and in turn asked a question about fluid resuscitation, something they had rehearsed in rounds. Lang corrected a subtle misunderstanding with such precision that it silenced the room. The correction wasn't harsh, it wasn't even direct. It was almost imperceptible, delivered in a clipped observation that revealed both knowledge and authority far beyond her rank. Harris felt a flicker of panic he refused to name. Every action Lang took reinforced the possibility that she was not ordinary. Every small correction, every anticipatory movement, every precise adjustment nudged him into doubt, a feeling unfamiliar and uncomfortable for someone who had spent decades in command. Even Mercer's body contributed to the unease. Small twitches, almost imperceptible movements, his left hand curling briefly, a subtle shift of his chest, occurred just as Lang adjusted a line or checked a monitor. Observers began to notice, whispers passing through the room like static. The tiny movements weren't enough to indicate consciousness, but enough to make everyone sense that something was happening they didn't yet understand. Harris's irritation returned, mingled with curiosity, suspicion, and a faint edge of fear. He couldn't articulate it. Something was off. And it wasn't Mercer. It wasn't even the monitors. It was her. She had acted alone, decisively, without waiting for orders, without seeking permission, without hesitation. And yet, every choice she made had been correct. Every small intervention, every minor adjustment, every quiet observation had preserved the patient. The audience, Patel, corpsmen, interns, even the other residents, noticed the subtle shift in hierarchy too. They had been trained to respect rank, to defer to authority. But here, the invisible currents of competence had tilted the room. Lang was not a subordinate in the conventional sense. She was a force moving unseen, and the room instinctively responded. By 3 a.m., the tension had settled into a strange equilibrium. Mercer's vitals were stable. The room was quiet. Harris stood at the edge of the bed, jaw tight, arms crossed, posture rigid. He had no words for what he had witnessed. No words to articulate the subtle power she exercised without command, without notice, without fanfare. And yet, the audience, every observer in the room, could feel it. Something was different. Something was off. Something that had been underestimated in the morning now hovered in every small movement, every subtle observation, every quiet correction. Lang didn't look at anyone. She didn't acknowledge whispers, glances, or the tight posture of the captain. She simply continued her work, calm, precise, almost serene. But the effect was undeniable. The room had shifted, authority bent slightly out of its usual form, and every observer, Harris included, was left with the creeping, unspoken realization that this was no ordinary nurse. No one spoke of it aloud. No one needed to. The tension, the small near misses, the micro-observations, they carried the message clearly enough. Something in Lang's competence was extraordinary. Something that unsettled the chain of command without revealing itself. And for the first time that night, Harris considered the possibility. He might not be fully in control. The emergency alarm cut through the ICU like a gunshot. Red lights pulsed, monitors blaring. Mercer's blood pressure had dropped precipitously, an arrhythmia sudden and violent. The room snapped to attention. Harris moved first, barking orders. Charge the defibrillator. Prep fluids. Call the OR. Lang didn't move toward the machine. She didn't shout. She didn't hesitate. Instead, she stepped forward, calm, deliberate. Her voice cut through the chaos, soft but impossible to ignore. Stand down. Clear the area. Hands off the lines. Harris froze. The nurses and corpsmen paused mid-action, instruments in hand. The room's movement slowed, as if the air itself had yielded to her presence. Stand down, she repeated. This time firmer, sharper. The authority in her tone carried something beyond rank. It didn't demand compliance, it commanded inevitability. Harris opened his mouth, ready to override. But the moment he stepped forward, Lang's hand lifted not in threat, but in precision gesture. Every eye in the room followed. Even Harris faltered. In a single fluid motion, Lang adjusted the ventilator, repositioned the patient's lines, and manually relieved the subtle intra-abdominal pressure causing the arrhythmia. The monitors stabilized instantly. Mercer's pulse strengthened. Blood pressure climbed back to normal range. The room exhaled as one. Instruments clattered as corpsmen lowered trays, interns stopped mid-step, and Patel's hand hovered over a clipboard before dropping it in silent acknowledgement. Harris's eyes were wide. The control he had exercised for years, the authority he assumed was absolute, evaporated in seconds. He had given orders, barked commands, but nothing had mattered. Lang had moved, and the room had followed. She didn't glance at anyone. Her attention remained fixed on Mercer, adjusting a line, checking a monitor, ensuring stability. Every movement precise, deliberate, confident. Harris swallowed hard. For the first time, he recognized the truth. She had never been a subordinate in the conventional sense. The realization struck him without words. "Sir," Lang said finally, without looking up, "he's stable. Cardiac output normalized. No further interventions required." Patel exhaled sharply, the tension draining from his shoulders. That was remarkable," he murmured. The other staff looked at Lang differently now. Where before there had been whispers and subtle doubt, now there was visible deference. They moved aside instinctively when she passed, checked her motions unconsciously against their own, waited for her assessment before acting. Even Harris, rigid as steel for decades, stepped back. His jaw tightened, eyes lingering on her with a mixture of respect, frustration, and something he refused to name aloud. The power in the room had shifted entirely, but no words could capture it. Lang finally straightened, gloved hands clasped in front of her. Not a trace of triumph in her posture, not a flicker of satisfaction. She had done what was necessary and nothing more. Harris's voice was low, measured, though it carried the weight of acknowledgement. "Explain what just happened." Lang didn't answer with explanation. She didn't need to. She simply gestured toward the stabilized monitors. The message was clear. The crisis was handled. Authority had been exercised, power demonstrated, competence undeniable. The room had changed. Every movement, every glance, every subtle adjustment now deferred, consciously or unconsciously, to her. And in that moment, the chain of command, the hierarchy Harris had relied upon for decades, felt like it had bent and shifted. The rookie nurse, the underestimated lieutenant, was in full control. Harris looked at her again, jaw tight, breathing controlled. A subtle nod, barely perceptible, left him no room for argument. The room had accepted it. He had accepted it. Everyone had. For a single heartbeat, the silence that followed was heavier than any alarm. Then the monitors beeped steadily, the ventilators hissed, and the ICU resumed its rhythm, but nothing would ever feel the same. The power had reversed. The room knew it. Harris knew it. And Lang, calm, precise, unassuming, remained the center of it, unshaken and undeniably authoritative. Morning light crept through the blinds of the ICU, washing the room in pale, sterile beams. The ventilators hummed steadily, monitors beeped at regular intervals, and Mercer's chest rose and fell in rhythm. The adrenaline of the previous night had faded, leaving only the quiet tension of consequence. Captain Harris stood near the doorway, shoulders rigid, arms crossed. He watched Lang as she checked lines and vital signs. Her movements were calm, methodical, precise, the same as last night, but stripped now of drama. There was no need for drama. The authority she had claimed in the moment of crisis was now part of her presence. The staff treated her differently today. Corpsmen, interns, even residents moved aside, allowed her to speak first, followed her observations without question. Whispers replaced chatter, subtle acknowledgement of skill, of authority quietly earned. Harris noticed it all, inwardly tallying the cost of his earlier insistence on hierarchy over competence. Harris cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Lang," he said, voice low, measured. "A debrief." "Now." Lang nodded and followed him into a small conference room adjacent to the ICU. The room was empty save for the two of them, yet it carried the weight of all eyes from the night before. Harris closed the door and leaned against the wall. His posture was relaxed outwardly, but his hands flexed at his sides, betraying a lingering tension. "You defied orders," he began, carefully. Not an accusation, but a statement. The weight of it hung in the air. "Yes, sir," Lang replied calmly. "To preserve the patient's life." "You succeeded," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "But that doesn't erase the breach of protocol." The chain of command exists for a reason. Lang nodded. I understand, sir. I am prepared to accept any formal review, any disciplinary action you deem necessary. Harris studied her for a moment, noting the unwavering calm in her tone, the lack of defensiveness, the precise articulation of accountability. He realized then that this was no ordinary officer or nurse. The quiet confidence, the precision under pressure, the control she exercised without theatrics, it was a rare combination, one that could not be corrected with reprimand. He exhaled slowly. No disciplinary action will be filed, he said, voice low but steady. But your methods, your judgment, need documentation. For protocol, for review, for the record. This will go into your file as extraordinary initiative, with all the details attached. Not punishment, but recognition. Lang inclined her head slightly. Understood, sir. Harris gestured to the door. Return to the floor. And he paused, searching for words he rarely admitted aloud. Keep your attention sharp. I won't question your competence again, but I will expect updates and I will expect transparency. Always. Yes, sir, she replied, crisp, controlled. Back on the floor, the after-effects rippled outward subtly. Residents who had watched from the edges of the trauma bay adjusted how they approached patient checks. They deferred to her subtly, consulting her first before making adjustments. Korsman followed her lead, anticipating actions she had not yet verbalized. It was not obedience born of fear, but acknowledgement of demonstrated skill. Patel lingered near the ventilator, observing her work without comment. Occasionally, his gaze flicked toward Harris, silently sharing what words could not convey. This was not insubordination. This was competence recognized, reluctantly, by all present. Harris moved through the room differently that day. He issued orders, yes, but with a tension beneath his calm that hadn't been there before. Every instruction carried an implicit acknowledgement. Lang had proven herself in ways that could not be ignored. He had to navigate around that without diminishing his own authority. A delicate balance of ego, professionalism, and reality. Even Mercer's presence contributed to the consequences. He remained unconscious, yet stable. His vital signs were evidence of Lang's intervention. The record would reflect a life preserved against the odds. Colleagues who later reviewed the case would see the combination of her knowledge, initiative, and precise execution. Harris understood the professional ramifications. Lang's reputation would grow, quietly but steadily, among those who mattered. And his own reputation, tempered by the admission of the rookie's superior judgment, would shift subtly among peers. Emotionally, the room carried traces of the previous night. Anxiety still lingered, but it had transformed into respect tinged with cautious awe. Harris felt it internally, the subtle discomfort of realizing his assumptions had been flawed, his expectations challenged. He couldn't articulate it fully, but he could feel the shift in the room's dynamics. Lang herself remained unchanged. No satisfaction, no triumph. Her calm persisted, her hands steady as she checked Mercer's lines and monitors. She did not revel in the power reversal. She accepted it as necessary, as part of her duty. The consequences were external. The ripple of awareness, the subtle shifts in how colleagues approached her, the tacit acknowledgement from a captain who had long relied on rank to enforce authority. By evening, the ICU settled into routine. Mercer's condition remained stable. Harris made his rounds with quiet attentiveness, observing Lang's work without interference. When she spoke, her assessments were accurate and concise. When she acted, the staff moved in tandem with her precision. The professional consequences had manifested naturally, acknowledgement, deference, and recalibration of hierarchy where skill demanded it. Harris paused outside Mercer's room, watching Lang adjust a line, check a monitor, and confirm the patient's stability. His expression was unreadable to most, but internally, a mixture of respect and discomfort lingered. In years of command, he had seldom encountered someone whose competence so subtly but completely reshaped the expectations of a team. The day ended with the quiet pulse of the ICU settling into rhythm. Monitors continued their steady beeping, Ventilators hissed softly, and the staff, now accustomed to the subtle shift in dynamics, moved through the room with professional efficiency. The consequences of the previous night were fully realized, not in dramatic punishments, not in vengeance, but in the understated recalibration of respect, authority, and trust. And in that quiet, calculated recalibration, Harris understood something fundamental. Authority could not be maintained through rank alone. Competence, decisiveness, and calm under pressure were equally, if not more, powerful. The realization was uncomfortable, humbling, but necessary. Lang finished her checks, collected her notes, and left the room, her presence leaving a lingering sense of order restored yet subtly altered. The staff moved differently now, not out of fear, but because they had witnessed authority exercised perfectly and consequences that were earned, unspoken, and enduring. Harris remained by the doorway, silent, eyes following her retreat. He had survived the night, but he had been taught a lesson few officers learned so clearly. True command could be challenged by skill, and it would bend, inevitably, to precision and competence. The hospital was quiet now, though never silent. The constant hum of ventilators and monitors provided a subtle heartbeat beneath the stillness, a reminder that life went on, relentless and indifferent. Outside the ICU, corridors were emptying, footsteps fading, and the long shadows of the afternoon sun stretched across polished floors. In this sterile calm, it was possible to notice things that went unseen in the chaos. The faint scuff of a shoe on tile, the quiet adjustment of a line, the soft intake of breath before action. Captain Harris sat in a corner office overlooking the ICU. His uniform was perfectly pressed, insignia gleaming, but the weight on his shoulders was heavier than any night of long hours or harsh orders he had endured in years. He had witnessed the unexpected, the quiet power of competence, exercised without fanfare, unassuming yet undeniable. It had unsettled him, forced him to confront a truth he had rarely considered, and one that would linger. Lieutenant Lang moved through the trauma bay again, her steps careful, deliberate. The corpsmen and residents instinctively gave her space, followed her cues, consulted her silently. Nothing was forced. There was no overt assertion of authority, no demand for recognition. Yet the room moved around her, aligning itself with her judgment, because it had to. Competence had made its case louder than rank ever could. Harris had spent his career valuing structure, obedience, and hierarchy. He had relied on authority like a shield, believing that rank alone could command results. He had not expected that a junior officer, someone new, underestimated, overlooked, could bend the chain of command simply by exercising precision, observation, and unwavering calm. The lesson was stark, quiet, and uncomfortable. Authority without respect was hollow. Power without trust was fragile. And skill, when executed with care and calm, could surpass the loudest orders, the strictest discipline, and even the weight of decades of experience. Lang did not seek acknowledgement. She did not pause to relish the deference that now followed her. Her focus was unshakable. Mercer's vitals, the lines, the monitors. Every adjustment, every observation, was performed as if it were the only thing in the world that mattered. And in that dedication, she taught something Harris could not ignore: humility in action, authority without assertion. Patel had stayed late, silently observing. When asked later why he had not intervened during the crisis, he replied simply, she didn't need intervention. She needed recognition, quiet, earned recognition. No one had protested her methods, and yet everyone had learned something. The quiet acknowledgement of skill had shifted the room's dynamics, not through punishment or praise, but through simple, undeniable proof. Harris reflected on the staff, the corpsmen, the interns. They had all been forced to recalibrate their expectations. The rookie nurse, once underestimated, once subjected to quiet humiliation for her initiative, had demonstrated something that could not be dismissed. Each observer carried a subtle awareness now. Competence, calm, precision, and moral clarity were as vital as rank, insignia, or years of service. He thought of Mercer, unconscious yet stabilized, a life preserved in the balance of micro-decisions and small, deliberate actions. The patient would never know the quiet battles fought to keep him alive, the subtle interventions that saved him. But the observers, Harris, Patel, the corpsmen, carried the memory, a reminder that authority was not granted by title alone, and that respect, once earned, reshaped the entire chain of command. Later, Harris walked through the empty corridors, the echo of his boots a rhythmic counterpoint to the quiet hum of the hospital. He thought of Lang, precise and unassuming, moving through the floor with a calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos that had defined the previous night. The contrast was instructive. She had not sought dominance. She had not sought acknowledgement. Yet she had commanded it all the same. There was a lesson in restraint here. In a world where authority is often wielded loudly, insistently, the quiet demonstration of capability can be far more powerful. And in a place where lives are fragile, where seconds matter, the subtle assertion of skill can be life-saving, unassuming yet absolute. Harris understood, finally, that leadership was as much about observing as issuing commands. About stepping back to allow skill and judgment to manifest. About humility, even when the instinct was to dominate. The power he had relied upon for decades had shifted in a single night, rearranged by a junior officer who had neither sought recognition nor approval. He thought of the young corpsman who had watched, wide-eyed, taking note of every subtle gesture. He thought of the interns who had paused mid-action, reconsidering how authority functioned in moments of crisis. And he thought of the other officers, quietly recalibrating their own assumptions, realizing that the hierarchy they trusted could bend under the weight of demonstrated competence. Lang finished her checks, straightened, and moved toward the door. She paused briefly, adjusting her mask, and her eyes met Harris's for a moment. No words passed between them. None were needed. The acknowledgement was silent, mutual. Respect had been earned, boundaries quietly understood, hierarchy subtly, irrevocably realigned. Harris remained standing, alone in the quiet room. The monitors continued their steady beeping. The ventilators hissed. The light slanted across the floor. The lesson lingered, as sharp as any command, as quiet as any unspoken truth. Authority and respect were not identical. Authority could be claimed by rank, but respect had to be earned, often in silence, through precision, calm, and undeniable competence. And humility, the quiet willingness to act without fanfare, was the strongest proof of all. He exhaled slowly, shoulders relaxing, though not completely. He would carry the memory of this night and the lessons it had brought, the subtle recalibration of command, the unspoken acknowledgement of skill, the quiet power of competence exercised without assertion. The hospital continued to breathe around him. Staff moved through their routines, corpsmen adjusted lines, monitors beeped in steady rhythm. And somewhere in the flow of sterile air and polished floors, one truth lingered: even the highest rank is hollow if unaccompanied by skill, humility, and quiet authority. And in that room, with the sun falling across the floor, Captain Harris realized finally that respect, once earned, was more permanent than any insignia. A pause, a breath, and the quiet, unwavering truth: some power speaks softly, but it is heard forever.